Commerce Alive Today presents
World Airlines. TWA's corporate history dates from July 16, 1930, and the forced merger of Transcontinental Air Transport, Western Air Express, Maddox Airlines, Standard, and Pittsburgh Aviation Industries Corporation to form Transcontinental and Western Air on October 1, 1930. The companies merged at the urging of Postmaster General Walter Folger Brown, who was looking for bigger airlines to give airmail contracts to. The airline brought high-profile aviation pioneers who would give the airline the panache of being called the Airman's Airline. TAT had the marquee expertise of Charles Lindbergh and was already offering a 48-hour combination of plane and train trips across the United States. We had the expertise of Jack Fry. TWA became known as the Lindbergh Line, with the shortest route coast to coast. On October 25, 1930, the airline offered one of the first all-plane scheduled services from coast to coast. The route took 36 hours, which included an overnight stay in Kansas City. In summer 1931, TWA moved its headquarters from New York to Kansas City, Missouri. On March 31, 1931, the airline suffered after the 1931 Transcontinental and Western Air Fokker F-10 crash near Matfield Green, Kansas. The crash killed all 8 on board, including University of Notre Dame football coach Canuta Rockne. The cause of the crash was linked to the wooden wings, one of which failed in flight. As a consequence, all of the airline's Fokker F-10s were grounded and later scrapped. TWA needed a replacement aircraft, but the first 60 modern all-metal Boeing 247s were promised to Boeing's sister company United Airlines. Both were subsidiaries of United Aircraft and Transport Corporation. TWA was forced to sponsor the development of a new airplane design. Specifications included the ability to fly the high-altitude route between Winslow, Arizona, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, with one engine inoperative. Other specifications included the capacity to carry 12 passengers and a range of 1,080 miles. On December 19, 1931, Ford Trimotor NC7119 crashed during a 2-engine takeoff from Oklahoma City, killing the co-pilot. The pilot survived. The aircraft was being ferried from Tulsa to Amarillo with a stop in Oklahoma City. On March 21, 1932, Northrop Alpha 3 NC966Y crashed in the Ohio River at Steubenville, Ohio, killing the pilot and passenger. During a Columbus-Pittsburgh cargo flight, the pilot encountered poor weather with heavy snow. He decided to bail out, but the cords of his parachute became lodged in the fuselage. The aircraft entered a dive, taking him with it. The female passenger was never found. On September 20, 1932, the development contract was signed with Douglas Aircraft Company and the Douglas DC-1 was delivered to TWA in December 1933, the sole example of its type. On December 14, 1932, Ford Trimotor lost control and crashed upside down on landing at English Field, Amarillo, Texas in a snowstorm, killing both pilots. 5. On July 28, 1933, Lockheed 9A Orion, ship number 256 stalled and crashed in the Missouri River shortly after takeoff from Kansas City Airport due to engine failure, killing the pilot. The aircraft was operating a Kansas City-Wichita mail flight. On August 29, 1933, Ford Trimotor entered a dive and struck the side of Mesa Mountain near Key, New Mexico in a severe rainstorm, killing all 5 on board. The aircraft was operating an Amarillo-Albuquerque passenger service. On February 18, 1934, Fry pilot and Eastern Airlines head Eddie Rickenbacker co-pilot, flew the DC-1 from Glendale, California, to Newark, New Jersey, setting a transcontinental record of 13 hours and 4 minutes. On April 17, Fry was elected president of TWA. Throughout 1934, Tommy Tomlinson set further load and distance records with the DC-1. At the same time, TWA used its Northrop Gamma as an experimental over-weather laboratory, in a desire to fly at altitudes above the weather. In 1934, following charges of favoritism in the contracts, the airmail scandal erupted, leading to the Airmail Act of 1934, which dissolved the forced Transcontinental-Western merger and ordered the United States Army Air Service to deliver the mail. However, Transcontinental opted to retain the T&WA name. With the company facing financial hardship, Lehman Brothers and John D. Hertz took over ownership of the company. The Army Flyers had a series of crashes, and it was decided to privatize the delivery with the provision that no former companies could bid on the contracts. T&WA added the suffix incorporated to its name, thus qualifying it as a different company. It was awarded 60% of its old contracts back in May 1934 and won back the rest within a few years. On May 6, 1935, Flight 6, a Douglas DC-2-112, crashed near Atlanta, Missouri, killing 5 of 13 on board, including New Mexico Republican Senator Bronson M. Cutting. The aircraft had been flying too low and poor visibility at night. A Bureau of Air Commerce investigation concluded that inaccurate weather forecasts as well as pilot and TWA ground personnel errors caused the crash. However, in June 1936, the Copeland Committee concluded that faulty navigation aids were to blame as well as criticizing the Bureau. This would lead to the creation of the Civil Aeronautics Authority in 1938. On April 7, 1936, Flight 1, a Douglas DC-2-112, struck Cheat Mountain in poor visibility due to pilot error, killing 12 of 14 on board. On March 25, 1937, Flight 15A, a Douglas DC-2-112, crashed in a nosedive near Clifton, Pennsylvania due to wing icing, killing all 13 on board. The DC-1 was followed by the delivery of 32 Douglas DC-2s that started operations in May 1934 on TWA's Columbus-Pittsburgh-Newark route. Most were phased out by 1937 as the Douglas DC-3 started service, but several DC-2s would be operational through the early years of World War II. TWA started using the DC-3 on June 1, 1937. The fleet included 10 DST sleeper aircraft and 8 standard DC-3 day versions. On January 29, 1937, TWA contracted with Boeing for 5 Boeing 307 Stratoliners, which included a pressurized cabin. However, the TWA board refused to authorize the expenditure. Fry then approached another flying enthusiast, Howard Hughes, along with Alger H. Meadows and his business partner Henry W. Peters, to buy stock in 1937. Hughes Tool Company purchased 99,293 shares at $8.25 a share, giving Hughes control, and Noah Dietrich was also placed on the board. Later, Hughes bought another $1,500,000 worth of stock. Paul E. Richter became executive vice president in 1938. On March 1, 1938, Flight 8, a Douglas DC-2-112, crashed on Buena Vista Peak in Yosemite National Park, killing all 9 on board. The wreckage was found 3 months later. The aircraft was probably blown off course in strong winds while attempting to divert to Fresno. A new order for 5 Stratoliners was placed on September 23, 1939. The first Stratoliner was delivered on May 6, 1940, and TWA initiated coast-to-coast flights on July 8, 1940. The planes could carry 16 night passengers in berths or 33 day passengers. The cabin was pressurized at 12,000 feet, enabling it to fly at an altitude of 20,000 feet, above much of the weather. On January 23, 1941, Trip 6, a Douglas DC-3B202, struck trees and crashed near St. Louis Airport in bad weather due to pilot error, killing 2 of 14 on board. The aircraft was completing the Kansas City-St. Louis leg of a transcontinental Los Angeles to New York service. TWA contracted its 5 Stratoliners to the Army Air Force's Air Transport Command after Pearl Harbor. Designated as C-75s, they flew 3,000 transatlantic flights to Africa and Europe. TWA also contracted to fly its C-54s and Lockheed C-69 Constellations. Hughes and TWA had developed the Constellation in secret with Lockheed, and Hughes purchased 40 for TWA's use in 1939, through his Hughes Tool Company. On April 17, 1944, Hughes and Fry flew the TWA Constellation from Burbank, California, to Washington, D.C., in 6 hours 58 minutes. By the war's end, 20 Constellations had been built. On January 16, 1942, Flight 3, a Douglas DC-3-382, struck Potosi Mountain due to a navigation error, killing all 22 on board, including movie star Carole Lombard, her mother, and 15 U.S. Army Air Corps personnel. On January 15, 1943, Douglas C-54 Skymaster broke up in midair for reasons unknown and crashed near Baki, Rensdorp, Suriname, killing all 35 on board in the first loss as well as the first fatal crash of the DC-4, C-54. The aircraft was operating for TWA on behalf of the Hughes Air Transport Command. On June 20, 1944, Flight 277, a Douglas C-54 Skymaster, struck Fort Mountain after the pilot became disoriented in severe weather, killing all 7 on board. The aircraft was operating for TWA on behalf of Hughes Air Transport Command. On November 4, 1944, Flight 8, a Douglas DC-3-454, crashed near Hanford, California following an in-flight breakup in bad weather and severe turbulence, killing all 24 on board. On December 1, 1944, Flight 18, a Douglas DC-3-209 crashed near Burbank, California following an unexplained, premature descent due to pilot error, killing 8 of 23 on board. TWA had 10 constellations by the end of 1945 and acquired international routes. TWA inaugurated its New York-Paris route on February 5, 1946, with the Star of Paris. The Italy route was initiated on 2 April and then extended to Cairo. Hughes flew the Star of California from Los Angeles to New York on February 15, 1946, in 8 hours and 38 minutes. Hollywood passengers included Cary Grant, Myrna Loy, William Powell, Frank Morgan, Walter Pidgeon, Tyrone Power, Edward G. Robinson. Hence TWA's reputation as the airline of the stars. On July 11, 1946, Flight 513, operated by Lockheed L049 Constellation Ship No. 557 Star of Lisbon, crashed near Reading, Pennsylvania during a training flight following an in-flight fire, killing 5 of 6 on board. Wiring in the baggage compartment arced, causing intense heat that ignited insulation and generated smoke to the point that the pilot lost control of the aircraft. All constellations were grounded from July 12 to August 23, 1946 so that fire detection equipment could be installed. On October 21, 1946, TWA pilots went on strike. The strike finally ended when TWA and the pilots' union agreed to binding arbitration on November 15, 1946. Additionally, TWA lost $14.5 million in 1946, owed $4.34 million in short-term debt and $38.9 million in long-term debt. Yet Hughes opposed Fry's financing proposals. On December 28, 1946, Flight 6963, operated by Lockheed L049 Constellation Ship No. 550 Cairo Skychief, crashed while on approach to Shannon Airport, killing 9 of 23 on board. The altimeter had been incorrectly wired, causing false readings. On May 11, 1947, Lockheed L049 Constellation Star of Athens crashed off Cape May Pount, Delaware Bay, New Jersey during a training flight following an unexplained loss of control, killing the 4 crew. Fry and Hughes had a falling out in 1947. Hughes's financial advisor Noah Dietrich wrote that Fry's inept handling of costs, his inefficient operations, his extravagance with new purchases of equipment, all these factors combined to nosedive the TWA stock from 71 at the war's end to 9 in 1947. The airline was losing $20 million a year, was in danger of not being able to acquire fuel for its planes due to being deeply indebted to oil companies, and the pilots' union went on strike. Hughes provided $10 million worth of financing, which was later converted to 1,039,000 shares. Fry was removed, and Hughes added 11 members to the board, giving him control. Thus ended the era of the airline run by flyers. Lamont Kohu took over as president, and TWA ordered 12 Lockheed L749 Constellations on October 18, 1947. Kohu was replaced by Ralph Damon in 1948. As president of American Airlines, Damon was a proponent of all being in the transatlantic market. Damon approved the mergers of All and American Export in 1945 to form American Overseas Airlines. When C.R. Smith sold OA to Pan American, Damon became disillusioned with All. As a consequence, Hughes was able to hire Damon to run TWA. Damon described air transportation as a race between technology and bankruptcy. Over the next 7 years, Damon introduced practices within the industry that became standard, such as multi-class service with first class and economy class. Damon also brought financial stability by eliminating the company deficit, which was reflected in the stock price rising into the 60s. Carter L. Burgess then took over in 1957, but lasted less than a year, unable to work with Hughes meddling. On November 18, 1947, Lockheed L049 Constellation Star of Madrid crashed at Newcastle County Airport, Delaware while completing a training flight, killing the 5 crew. The pilot landed the aircraft short of the runway but became airborne after hitting an embankment, after which it landed on the runway and skidded forward some 1,300 feet. The right wing was torn off as the fuselage turned upside down. Spilled fuel ignited and the aircraft burned out. On May 31, 1949, TWA ordered 20 Lockheed 749s. They were operated by TWA for the next 17 years. On February 22, 1950, TWA signed a contract with the Glenn L. Martin Company for 12 Martin 202s and 30 Martin 404s. The first plane was delivered on July 14, 1950. TWA's Martin fleet was eventually increased to 53 planes, and they remained operational until 1961. On May 17, 1950, the airline officially changed its name to World Airlines. On December 5, 1950, TWA ordered 10 Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellations, which were delivered in 1952. On October 19, 1953, TWA offered non-stop transcontinental service. On August 31, 1950, Flight 903, operated by Lockheed L-749A Constellation Star of Maryland, crashed near Idi El Baroud, Egypt while attempting a forced landing following a failure, fire and separation of the No. 3 engine, killing all 55 on board. The engine failure was caused by the failure of the rear master rod bearing on the No. 3 engine, ultimately causing the rear connecting rods to tear through the cylinder walls and crankcase as well as breaking oil lines, causing the fire. TWA's flight operations were based at Kansas City Municipal Airport, while their overhaul base was located at Fairfax Airport. When the Great Flood of 1951 destroyed the facility, the city of Kansas City helped TWA build a new facility on 5,000 acres, 18 miles north of downtown at what became Kansas City International Airport. On July 10, 1953, TWA ordered 20 Lockheed 1049s, which was later changed to be 1049Gs. They were put in service on April 1, 1955. On September 25, TWA introduced multiple class services, first in economy. On October 30, they inaugurated their Los Angeles-London route, via New York. On December 23, 1954, the Hughes Tool Company ordered 25 Lockheed L-1449 turboprops. On March 29, 1955, this order was changed to piston-powered L-1649s. Hughes transferred the planes to TWA in 1956, after receiving Civil Aeronautics Board approval. The first L-1649A was delivered on May 4, 1957. Fully reclining seats were later added to the airliner. On January 12, 1955, Flight 694, operated by Martin 202A Skyliner Lancaster, collided in midair with a private DC-3 over Cincinnati, Ohio, killing all 15 on board both aircraft. On February 19, 1955, Flight 260, operated by Martin 404 Skyliner Binghamton, struck Sandia Mountain, New Mexico following an unexplained course change, killing all 16 on board. In February 1956, Hughes Tool Company placed an order with Pratt & Whitney for 300 jet engines, JT3s and JT4s. On March 2, 1956, Hughes Tool Company placed an order for 8 domestic Boeing 707s, later increased to 15 aircraft on January 10, 1957, and an order for 18 international 707s on March 19, 1956, bringing the total order with Boeing to 33 jet planes. On April 1, 1956, Flight 400, operated by Martin 404 Skyliner Pittsburgh, crashed on climb-out from Greater Pittsburgh Airport, killing 22 of 36 on board. Just as the aircraft lifted off, the aircraft entered a sharp yaw and the co-pilot reduced power. The fire warning light for the No. 1 engine came on, but the warning bell did not go off. The No. 1 engine was throttled down and the co-pilot reached for the manual feathering button, but the pilot prevented him and indicated that the propeller would auto-feather, but this never happened because the throttle was pulled back too far. The aircraft continued to yaw to the left until it crashed. It was revealed that the fire warning was false, caused by a failed hose clamp allowing exhaust gas to trip a overheat detector. On June 7, 1956, Hughes placed an order for 30 Convair 880 Skylarks. TWA suffered from its late entry to the jet age, and Hughes' 1956 order cost $497 million. The transaction ultimately resulted in Hughes losing control of the airline. On June 30, 1956, Flight 2, operated by Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation Star of the same collided with United Airlines Flight 718, a DC-7, over the Grand Canyon due to ATC errors, killing all 128 on board both aircraft. In 1958, TWA became the first major airline to hire an African-American flight attendant, hiring Margaret Grant after another African-American woman, Dorothy Franklin of Astoria, Queens, New York, filed a lawsuit alleging that she had been discriminated against because of poor complexion, unattractive teeth and legs that were not shapely. New York Governor W. Averell Harriman praised her hiring, saying the action would raise American prestige abroad. Charles Sparks Thomas became president on July 2, 1958. The inaugural flight of TWA's Boeing 707 took place on March 20, 1959. On June 19, 1959, Flight 891, operated by Lockheed L-1649 Starliner Star of Severn was struck by lightning and crashed near Marnate, Italy, killing all 68 on board. On November 24, 1959, Flight 595, a Lockheed L-1049H Super Constellation crashed in Chicago while attempting to return to Midway Airport following a fire warning on the No. 2 engine due to excessive descent caused by pilot error, killing all 3 crew and 8 people on the ground. The aircraft was beginning a Chicago-Los Angeles cargo service. In 1961, TWA introduced in-flight movies. In 1962, TWA started using Doppler radar on its international flights. In 1960, Hughes relinquished control, as the major stockholder, through the financial terms associated with the purchase. As a consequence of that deal, Charles C. Tillinghast Jr. took over as president. The battle over Hughes' control continued in court until 1966 when Hughes was forced to sell his stock. That sale brought Hughes $546,549,771. Under a plan put together by Dillon, Reed and Company, a $165 million loan was raised to fund a 45-jet fleet. The deal was signed on December 30, 1960 by Hughes lawyer Raymond Holliday, who constituted one member of a 3-person voting trust, with the other 2 members, Ernest R. Breach and Irving S. Olds, represented the financing institutions. On December 16, 1960, Flight 266, operated by Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellation Star of Sicily collided with United Airlines Flight 826, a DC-8, over Staten Island, New York, killing all 128 on board both aircraft. Another 5 later 6 on the ground also die. The DC-8 had been flying too fast and left the airspace assigned to it. On June 30, 1961, TWA filed a federal suit against Hughes, Hughes Tool Company, and Raymond Holliday. Then on April 18, 1962, TWA filed a Delaware suit against Hughes and Hughes Tool Company. On January 10, 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against TWA in the federal case. However, on May 15, 1986, Delaware ruled in favor of TWA for the state case, eventually awarding TWA $48,346,000. TWA started operating its Convair 880s on January 12, 1961 but would report a net loss of $38.7 million for 1961. TWA reported a net profit of $19.8 million in 1963, $37 million in 1964, and $50.1 million in 1965. TWA stock went from $7.50 per share in 1962 to $62 in 1965. Flight 529, operated by Lockheed L-049 Constellation Star of Dublin, pitched up, stalled and crashed on climb-out from Midway Airport, killing all 78 on board. A 5/16" bolt fell out of the elevator boost mechanism on climb-out, causing the pitch up. In 1962, TWA opened Trans World Flight Center, now Terminal 5, at New York City's JFK Airport and designed by Eero Saarinen. The terminal was expanded in 1969 to accommodate jumbo jets, went dormant in 2001, and underwent renovation and expansion beginning in 2005. A new terminal with a crescent-shaped entry hall and now serving JetBlue opened in 2008, partially encircling the landmark. The head house was renovated by Morse Development along with MCR and turned into the TWA Hotel, which opened on May 15, 2019. Under new management, the Trans World Corporation expanded to purchase Hilton Hotels, Hardee's, Canteen Corporation, and Century 21 Realty. Employment grew to nearly 10,000 employees. In 1964, TWA started a program to assist in the United States export expansion effort that became known as the TWA Market Air corporate logo to promote business passenger air travel and as a marketing tool to be used in air cargo sales. This marketing effort was initiated by the Senior Vice President of Marketing, Thomas B. McFadden, in collaboration with the Bureau of International Commerce, important U.S. financial institutions, and export expansion entities to offer tools that small and medium-sized U.S. companies could use at low or no cost to expand their exports. Staff management of this program was under the direction of Joseph S. Cooper. A key element of this program was the Market Air newsletter in a number of languages targeted to American exporters and international travelers. In 1964, TWA opened its New York office. On November 23, 1964, Flight 800, a Boeing 707-331, veered off the runway on takeoff from Fiumicino Airport, killing 50 of 73 on board. During takeoff, the No. 4 engine indicated zero thrust and the thrust reverser deployment light for the No. 2 engine came on. The crew aborted the takeoff below V1 speed some 800 to 900 meters down the runway, but the aircraft did not slow as quickly as the crew expected and veered to the right, after which the No. 4 engine hit a pavement roller. The thrust reverser on the No. 2 engine was not working. TWA was one of the first airlines, after Delta Air Lines, to embrace the spoke hub distribution paradigm and was one of the first with the Boeing 747. It planned to use the 747 along with the supersonic transport to fly people between the West/Midwest via Kansas City and New York City via John F. Kennedy International Airport to Europe and other world destinations. As part of this strategy, TWA's hub airports were to have gates close to the street. The TWA-style airport design proved impractical when hijackings to Cuba in the late 1960s caused a need for central security checkpoints. On April 7, 1967, TWA became one of the first all-jet airlines in the USA with the retirement of their last Lockheed L-749A Constellation and L-1649 Starliner cargo aircraft. That morning, aircraft ground service personnel placed a booklet on every passenger seat throughout the TWA system titled "Props are for boats." On November 6, 1967, Flight 159, a Boeing 707-131, overran the runway and crashed following an aborted takeoff at Cincinnati/Northern Kentucky International Airport, killing one of 36 on board. During the takeoff roll, the 707 passed a Delta DC-9 that was stuck in mud next to the runway, and the jet blast from the DC-9 caused a compressor stall in the No. 4 engine of the 707. The pilot thought he had hit the DC-9 and aborted the takeoff. On November 20, 1967, Flight 128, a Convair 880, struck trees and crashed while on approach to Cincinnati due to crew error, killing 70 of 82 on board. Between 1967-72, TWA was the world's third-largest airline by passenger miles, behind Aeroflot and United. During the mid- and late 1960s, the airline extended its reach as far east as Hong Kong from Europe and also introduced service to several destinations in Africa. In 1969, TWA carried the most transatlantic passengers of any airline. Until then, Pan American World Airways had always been number one. In the Trans-Pacific route case of 1969, TWA was given authority to fly across the Pacific to Hawaii and Taiwan, and for a few years, TWA had a round-the-world network. On July 4, 1968, Flight 329, a Boeing 727, was hijacked by a federal prisoner who claimed that there was a second man on board armed with a gun and dynamite. Although this was later proven false, he was subdued by 2 U.S. Marshals who were escorting him. All 77 on board survived. On December 11, 1968, Flight 496, a Boeing 727, was hijacked to Cuba 20 minutes after takeoff from Nashville by one man who pulled out a gun and entered the cockpit. After landing at Havana, the hijacker and a female passenger exited the aircraft. All 39 on board survived. On June 17, 1969, Flight 154, a Boeing 707, was hijacked to Cuba by William Lee Brent. All 89 on board survived. In 1969, TWA opened the Breach Academy on a 25-acre campus in the Kansas City suburb of Overland Park, Kansas to train its flight attendants, ticket agents, and travel agents, as well as to provide flight simulators for its pilots. It became the definitive airline facility, training other airline staff, as well as its own. On July 26, 1969, Flight 5787, a Boeing 707-331C, lost control and crashed at Atlantic City International Airport during a training flight, killing the 5 crew. The crew were simulating takeoffs and landings with one engine out. During an approach, hydraulic power was lost, due to a failure in the left outboard spoiler actuator that dumped all hydraulic fluid overboard. With no power to the rudder actuator, at low speed, gear down, full flaps, and 3 engines, a loss of control resulted and the aircraft crashed. Kansas City approved a $150 million bond issue for the TWA hub there. TWA vetoed plans for a Dulles International Airport-style hub and spoke gate structure. Following union strife, the airport ultimately cost $250 million when it opened in 1972, with Vice President Spiro Agnew officiating. TWA's gates, which were intended to be within 100 feet of the street, became obsolete because of security issues. Kansas City refused to rebuild its terminals as Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport rebuilt its similar terminals, forcing TWA to look for a new hub. Missouri politicians moved to keep it in the state, and in 1982, TWA began a decade-long move to Lambert International Airport in St. Louis. On July 31, 1969, Flight 79, a Boeing 727, was hijacked to Cuba by a prisoner under escort. He had previously threatened a flight attendant with a razor blade. All 131 on board survived. On August 29, 1969, Flight 840, a Boeing 707-331B, was hijacked to Damascus by 2 members of the PFLP. All 127 on board evacuated the aircraft, after which the nose section was blown up by one of the hijackers. All crew and passengers except for 6 Israeli passengers were released by Syrian authorities. 4 would be released the next day and the remaining 2 in December 1969 in exchange for 71 Syrian and Egyptian soldiers released by Israel. The aircraft was repaired with a new nose diverted from the Renton production line and returned to service with registration N28714. On October 31, 1969, Flight 85, a Boeing 707, was hijacked to Rome. All 47 on board survived. On December 2, 1969, Flight 54, a Boeing 707, was flying over Omaha, Nebraska when it was hijacked to Cuba. All 28 on board survived. TWA introduced the Boeing 747 to its fleet in 1970. After the merger with Hilton International in 1967, TWA's holding company, Trans World Corporation, continued to diversify, buying Canteen Corporation in 1973, and then the Hardee's restaurant franchises. Financial woes in the 1970s included a flight attendants' strike, higher fuel prices after the Arab oil embargo, and airline deregulation. During the early 1970s, the aviation industry faced significant challenges due to a severe economic downturn. TWA, in particular, had difficulties as their Boeing 747s and Lockheed L-1011s flew with very low passenger numbers. TWA had originally purchased these planes not because they needed them for their operations, but rather because Pan Am had ordered a large number of them. Consequently, TWA had to manage excess capacity with a fleet of oversized planes that exceeded their actual requirements. By 1975, the financial obligations of some payrolls could only be fulfilled by promptly selling 6 Boeing 747 aircraft to the Iranian Air Force. The financial deal involving TWA, in which the jetliners were sold for around 1/6 of their true value, was regrettable. However, the airline was in a state of desperation for immediate liquidity. TWA was experiencing financial losses on its Trans-Pacific route. In a significant milestone, TWA's network expanded globally for the first time in its corporate history. However, this achievement would be short-lived as subsequent events led to its eventual termination. On January 8, 1970, Flight 802, a Boeing 707 was hijacked to Beirut where the hijacker surrendered. All 20 on board survived. On June 4, 1970, Flight 486, a Boeing 727 was hijacked at Washington, D.C. by a man demanding a ransom. All 58 on board survived. August 24, 1970, Flight 134, a Boeing 727 was hijacked by a man who demanded to be taken to Cuba. All 86 on board survived. September 6, 1970, Flight 741, a Boeing 707-331B, was flying over Brussels when it was hijacked to Jordan by members of the PFLP. Hostages were released a week later and the aircraft was blown up. September 15, 1970, a Boeing 707 was hijacked by a gun-wielding man demanding to be taken to North Korea. 35 passengers were released when the aircraft landed at San Francisco. A security guard on board as a passenger drew his gun and shot and wounded the hijacker. June 11, 1971, Flight 358, a Boeing 727, was hijacked by 23-year-old Gregory White who boarded without a ticket. White then drew a gun and held it to a flight attendant's head and demanded to be flown to North Vietnam as well as demanding a machine gun and $75,000. The passengers left the aircraft while an air marshal sneaked on board, but one passenger who returned to the aircraft was shot and killed by the hijacker. Negotiations began and the aircraft was flown to New York to find a larger aircraft for travel to North Vietnam, but en route to New York, a shootout ensued with White. He was shot in the arm by an FBI agent after landing in New York and then arrested after surrendering. On July 23, 1971, a man was shot and killed at LaGuardia Airport while attempting to hijack Flight 335, a Boeing 727, after attempting to hijack a TWA Boeing 707 to Italy. On November 27, 1971, Flight 106, a Boeing 727, was hijacked by 3 members of Republic of New Africa and demanded to be flown to Africa, but the crew talked them into flying to Cuba. During a refueling stop at Tampa, the passengers were released and the aircraft continued to Havana. On January 29, 1972, Flight 2, a Boeing 707, was hijacked at New York by a man who demanded a ransom and release of prisoners. The aircraft was stormed and the hijacker was arrested. On August 28, 1973, TWA Flight 742, a Boeing 707-331B, experienced severe in-flight oscillation over the Pacific Ocean. One critically injured passenger died 2 days later. On September 8, 1974, Flight 841, a Boeing 707-331B, crashed in the Ionian Sea off the Greek coast after a bomb on board exploded, killing all 88 on board. On December 1, 1974, Flight 514, a Boeing 727-231, struck Mount Weather, Virginia due to crew and ATC errors, killing all 92 on board. In 1975, World Airlines was headquartered in Turtle Bay, in Midtown Manhattan. The uniforms for the flight attendants during this decade went through 3 different designers. From 1971 to 1974, the official TWA uniform was designed by Valentino. From 1974 to 1978, the official TWA uniform was designed by Stan Herman, and from 1978 to 2001, the official TWA uniform was designed by Ralph Lauren. On September 10, 1976, Flight 355, a Boeing 727, was hijacked by 5 members of Fighters for Free Croatia, a group seeking Croatian independence from Yugoslavia, and flown to Montreal and later to Gander where 35 passengers were released and finally onto Iceland with a larger TWA aircraft escorting it. The bomb on board the aircraft was revealed to be fake, but the bomb placed at Grand Central Station was real and it exploded while being dismantled, killing an NYPD officer and injuring another. On January 11, 1977, Flight 700, a Boeing 747, was hijacked by a man demanding to go to Uganda and claimed that he had a grenade. He was subdued several hours later when he became violent. August 25, 1978, a passenger dropped a note next to a napping flight attendant on board Flight 830, a Boeing 707-300, demanding the release of several prisoners, including Rudolf Hess. After landing at Geneva, all passengers deplaned and were questioned by Swiss authorities to determine the identity of the hijacker. On December 21, 1978, Flight 541, a Douglas DC-9, was hijacked by a man who demanded release of prisoners. The aircraft was stormed and the hijacker arrested. Facing the pressures of deregulation, the airline consolidated its route system around a domestic hub in St. Louis, aided by its purchase of Ozark Airlines in 1986, and an international gateway in New York. It was able to remain profitable during this time because of its good route positioning and the relatively low costs of adapting its operations. On December 5, 1981, Flight 534, a Boeing 707, was hijacked by a man who was then subdued. On October 27, 1982, a pocket-knife-wielding man attempted to hijack Flight 72, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, at Los Angeles. He forced his way on board and tried but failed to get into the cockpit. He got on the intercom system and demanded that the aircraft take off, but did not give a destination. A deputy sheriff on board as a passenger had the hijacker open an emergency door, presumably to cool off the aircraft. While the hijacker looked out the door, the sheriff pushed him out of the aircraft and he fell to the ground. The hijacker was arrested and taken to a hospital for treatment of injuries he suffered when he fell and later received a 12-year prison sentence for air piracy. In 1983, Trans World Corporation spun off the airline. In 1985, TWA's board agreed to sell the airline to Frank Lorenzo's Texas Air Corporation. Due to Texas Air's ownership of non-union carriers Continental Airlines and New York Air, as well as Lorenzo's reputation of being a union buster, TWA's unions objected to the sale, and instead supported a takeover deal from Carl Icahn by offering concessions on condition that Icahn's deal be accepted by the board. Directors subsequently agreed, and the Texas Air deal was scrapped. Following the sale, Icahn appointed himself as chairman of the airline. Also in 1985, TWA closed its hub at Pittsburgh International Airport after nearly 20 years as a hub. The following year, TWA acquired Ozark Airlines, a regional carrier based at Lambert St. Louis International Airport, for $250 million. This transaction increased TWA's share of employments in St. Louis from 56.6% to 82%. TWA had pilot bases in many European cities such as Berlin, Frankfurt, Zurich, Rome, and Athens. These bases were used to provide crews for the Boeing 727s which TWA operated in its European route network. Its Boeing 727 aircraft served Cairo, Athens, Rome, London, Paris, Geneva, Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Stuttgart, Zurich, Amsterdam, Oslo, Vienna, and Istanbul. On June 14, 1985, Flight 847, a Boeing 727-231, was hijacked by two Shiite Lebanese men and diverted to Beirut where 19 passengers were released in exchange for fuel, after which the aircraft flew on to Algiers where another 20 passengers were released. The aircraft flew back to Beirut where U.S. Navy diver Robert Stetham was beaten and shot and dumped on the tarmac. 7 American passengers with Jewish-sounding names were held at a Shia prison in Beirut. A dozen armed men joined the hijackers, after which the aircraft flew back to Algiers where another 65 passengers and all 5 female flight crew were released. The hijackers wanted to fly to Iran, but returned to Beirut a third time instead, where the remaining hostages were released by June 30. On February 27, 1986, Flight 348, a Boeing 727, was hijacked by a female passenger. She became angry after being told to put out a cigarette before takeoff. En route to New York, she threatened a crew member with a knife, but later surrendered it to a crew member and was arrested after landing in New York. The hijacker had a history of mental problems. On April 2, 1986, a bomb on board Flight 840, a Boeing 727-231, detonated over Argos, Greece, blowing a hole in the right side of the fuselage. Although 4 passengers were sucked out of the aircraft and killed, the aircraft landed safely at Athens with no other casualties. In 1987, Icahn moved the company's main offices from Manhattan to office buildings he owned in Mount Kisco. TWA earned a profit of $106.2 million in 1987. In September 1988, TWA stockholders approved a plan to take the company private, winning Icahn $469 million in personal profit, but adding $539.7 million in debt to TWA. TWA's zenith as an international carrier occurred in the summer of 1988, when, for the only time, the airline carried more than 50% of all transatlantic passengers. Every day, Boeing 747, Lockheed L1011, and Boeing 767 aircraft departed to more than 30 cities in Europe, fed by a small but effective domestic operation focused on moving U.S. passengers to New York or other gateway cities for wide-body service across the Atlantic, while a similar inter-European operation shuttled non-U.S. passengers to TWA's European gateways, London, Paris, which was even considered a European hub by TWA, and Frankfurt, for travel to the United States. On December 11, 1988, Flight 469, a Boeing 727, was hijacked between Florida and Puerto Rico by a man demanding to go to Cuba, but the pilot diverted to Grand Turk instead. After landing, the hijacker was tricked into believing he was in Cuba and was arrested. Although the hijacker claimed there was a bomb on board, no bomb was found. In 1989, TWA decided to replace its fleet of Boeing 727 Series 100 aircraft with the former Ozark Airlines DC-9s. This decision was based on the economics of operating 3 crew airplanes with 3 engines, versus operating 2 crew airplanes with 2 engines. Both airplanes had about the same passenger and cargo capacity, so it was decided to replace the Boeing fleet. To prepare for this transition, TWA positioned several $1 million worth of spare parts for the DC-9s in Germany. This was a requirement dictated by the German government. If TWA wanted to use DC-9s in the service of the German population, then TWA had to provide readily available spare parts for its fleet. The airline also sent its senior DC-9 pilots to Europe to observe the operations in preparation for the changeover of the crews that were to follow. Shortly before the DC-9 airplanes began arriving in Germany, however, the entire plan was cancelled because the leasing contracts that Carl Icahn had created for the former Ozark DC-9 specifically forbade any operations outside the continental limits of the United States. In 1990, Icahn's pressing need for additional capital forced him to sell the airline's Heathrow operations to American Airlines about the same time that Pan American World Airways sold its Heathrow operation to United. Tillinghast's analysis overlooked the possible implications of the Trans-Pacific industry in the specialized air freight market. Based on available reports, there are allegations that he purportedly articulated the perspective that the Pacific area and the freight business exhibit a deficiency in financial performance. The primary aim of their endeavor was to diminish the scale of the airline to achieve financial sustainability. These 2 oversights are said to have been the undoing of TWA, in addition to Sandro Andretti's resignation in December 1991. Airline deregulation hit TWA hard in the 1980s. TWA had badly neglected domestic U.S. expansion at a time when the newly deregulated domestic market was growing quickly. TWA's holding company, Trans World Corporation, spun off the airline, which then became starved for capital. The airline briefly considered selling itself to renowned corporate raider Frank Lorenzo in the 1980s, but ended up selling to yet another corporate raider, Carl Icahn, in 1985. Under Icahn's direction, many of its most profitable assets were sold to competitors, much to the detriment of TWA. Icahn was eventually ousted in 1993, though not before the airline was forced to file for bankruptcy on January 31, 1992. Negotiations continued until a deal was reached on August 24, 1992. In that deal, Icahn had to pay TWA $150 million, the employees reduced compensation by 15% over the next 3 years, and the creditors forgave $1 billion in debt. When TWA emerged from bankruptcy in November 1993, employees owned 45% of the company. Jeffrey H. Erickson took over as president in 1994, moved its headquarters to St. Louis, and sponsored the Trans World Dome. On November 22, 1994, TWA Flight 427, a McDonnell Douglas MD-82, collided on the runway with a Cessna 441 at Lambert International Airport due to pilot error, killing both pilots in the Cessna. All 140 on board the MD-82 survived. The MD-82 was repaired and returned to service. When Carl Icahn left in 1993, he arranged to have TWA give Carabo Corporation, an entity he controlled, the rights to buy TWA tickets at 45% off published fares through September 2003. This was named the Carabo deal. The ticket program agreement, which began on June 14, 1995, excluded tickets for travel which originated or terminated in St. Louis, Missouri. Tickets were subject to TWA's normal seat assignment and boarding pass rules and regulations. They were not assignable to any other carrier and were not endorsable. No commissions were paid to Karabu by TWA for tickets sold under the Ticket Program Agreement. By agreement dated August 14, 1995, LowestFare.com LLC, a wholly owned operating subsidiary of Karabu, was joined as a party to the Ticket Program Agreement. Pursuant to the Ticket Program Agreement, LowestFare.com could purchase an unlimited number of system tickets. System tickets are tickets for all applicable classes of service which were purchased by Karabu from TWA at a 45% discount from TWA's published fare. In addition to system tickets, LowestFare.com could also purchase domestic consolidator tickets, which are tickets issued at bulk fare rates and were limited to specified origin/destination city markets and did not permit the holder to modify or refund a purchased ticket. Karabu's purchase of domestic consolidator tickets was subject to a cap of $70 million per year based on the full retail price of the tickets. On most TWA flights, Karabu could buy at a heavy discount and then sell a certain portion of all TWA's available seats. As a result, TWA was hamstrung by the high proportion of heavily discounted seats that had been sold and was essentially left with no control over its pricing. It could not afford to discount any of its seats, and if TWA wanted to increase revenue on busy routes by putting a larger plane into service, Karabu would only claim more seats. TWA was losing an estimated $150 million a year in revenue due to this deal. To ameliorate the Karabu deal, TWA went in and out of bankruptcy in 1995. TWA entered its second bankruptcy on June 30, 1995. When TWA emerged in August 1995, employee ownership was reduced to 30%, but the company was relieved of $0.5 billion of its $1.8 billion debt. On July 17, 1996, Flight 800, a Boeing 747-131, exploded in midair and crashed in the Atlantic Ocean off East Moriches, New York, killing all 230 on board. By 1998, TWA had reorganized as a primarily domestic carrier, with routes centered on hubs in St. Louis and New York. Partly in response to TWA Flight 800 and the age of its fleet, TWA announced a major fleet renewal, ordering 125 new aircraft. TWA paid for naming rights for the new Trans World Dome, home of the then St. Louis Rams, in its corporate hometown. In June 1994, its headquarters moved to One City Center in downtown St. Louis. TWA's fleet renewal program included adding newer and smaller, more fuel-efficient, longer-range aircraft such as the Boeing 757 and 767 and short-range aircraft such as the McDonnell Douglas MD-80 and Boeing 717. Aircraft such as the Boeing 727 and 747, along with the Lockheed L-1011 and older DC-9s, some from Ozark in the 1960s, were retired. TWA also became one of the early customers for the Airbus A318 through International Lease Finance Corporation. TWA, had it continued operating through 2003, would have been the first U.S. carrier to fly the type. TWA had international code share agreements with Royal Jordanian Airlines, Kuwait Airways, Royal Air Maroc, Air Europa, and Air Malta. In 1997, a code-share agreement was signed with Air Ukraine with plans to begin service between Paris and Kyiv by 1999. Domestic code-share with American West Airlines was started, with long-term plans for a merger considered. The airline's routes were also changed, several international destinations were dropped or changed. The focus of the airline became domestic with a few international routes through its St. Louis hub and smaller New York JFK and San Juan, Puerto Rico hubs. Domestically, the carrier improved services with redesigned aircraft and new services, including Pay and Coach, Fly in First, whereby coach passengers could be upgraded to first class when flying through St. Louis. Internationally, services were cut. European destinations eventually were limited to London and Paris, and in the Middle East, to Cairo, Riyadh, and Tel Aviv. TWA stated that it planned to make Los Angeles a focus city around October 2000, with a partnership with American Eagle Airlines as part of Trans World Connection. Financial problems soon resurfaced and Trans World Airlines Incorporated assets were acquired in April 2001 by AMR Corporation, the parent company of American Airlines, which quickly formed a new company called TWA Airlines LLC. As part of the deal, TWA declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the third time the day after it agreed to the purchase. The terms of the deal included a $745 million payment. The bankruptcy court approved the purchase over a rival bid by Jet Acquisition Group, an investment group fronted by Ralph Atkin, founder of SkyWest Airlines. The total value of TWA's assets and assumed liabilities was estimated to be $2 billion. American did not claim the naming rights for the Rams home, which eventually became the Edward Jones Dome and later the Dome at America's Center. TWA booking ended on November 30, 2001. TWA Airlines LLC flew its last flight on December 1, 2001, with an MD-83 aircraft painted in a special inverted livery named Wings of Pride. The ceremonial last flight was Flight 220 from Kansas City to St. Louis, with CEO Captain William Compton at the controls. The final flight before TWA was officially absorbed by American Airlines was completed between St. Louis and Las Vegas, Nevada, also on December 1, 2001. At 10 p.m. CST on that date, employees began removing all TWA signs and placards from airports around the country, replacing them with American Airlines signs. At midnight, all TWA flights officially became listed as American Airlines flights. Some aircraft carried hybrid American/TWA livery during the transition, with American's tricolor stripe on the fuselage and TWA titles on the tail and forward fuselage. Signage still bears the TWA logo in portions of Concourse D at Lambert St. Louis International Airport. American Airlines acquired some ambassadors' clubs. Other ambassadors' clubs closed on December 2, 2001. TWA's St. Louis hub shrank after the acquisition, due to its proximity to American's larger hub at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. As a result, American initially replaced TWA's St. Louis mainline hub with regional jet service going from over 800 operations a day to just over 200 and downsized TWA's maintenance base in Kansas City. In September 2009, American Airlines announced its intent to shut down the St. Louis hub it inherited from TWA and, in October 2009, American Airlines announced its intent to close the Kansas City maintenance base by September 2010. On December 16, 2013, Doug Parker, CEO of American Airlines Group, announced that TWA heritage aircraft would be added in the future. We will continue that tradition at American, including introducing a TWA aircraft in the future and keeping a U.S. Airways livery aircraft. That also means we will keep a heritage American livery in the fleet. On November 16, 2015, American painted a 737-823 in the TWA livery with American titles, as shown to the right. The last of the TWA MD-83 stayed in service until September 2019. This was the last World Airlines Incorporated aircraft in the American Airlines fleet. An original lighted TWA sign still exists as of 2019 on the east side of Saarland's TWA Flight Center terminal facing JetBlue's Terminal 5. This sign has been incorporated by the TWA Hotel as part of their use of the TWA Flight Center building. On May 15, 2019, the TWA Hotel opened in the Flight Center's head house, after 4 years of restoration work that began in 2015. In addition to replacing and repairing much of the infrastructure of the building, additional buildings were constructed to house the hotel rooms, with the Flight Center's interior being used for the lobby, restaurants and exhibition facilities. In addition, a vintage Lockheed Constellation L-1649 Starliner was acquired and fully restored for use as the hotel's cocktail bar, being placed on a section of apron in front of the hotel.
Right before your eyes, TWA is creating a brand new way for business flyers to fly coast to coast. A business class in a separate cabin with bigger, wider seats than in coach, but fewer seats so you're less crowded. It's TWA's new Ambassador class to the East Coast, with enough room for anybody.
Even if you're 7'1" or taller, it's taller. Little.
If you have any fond memories, please indicate it at the comments below. Thanks for watching, subscribe and like.